pawn e4, pawn e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, knight f6, pawn d4, pawn takes d4, castles kingside, bishop e7, pawn e5, knight e4, knight takes d4, castles kingside, knight f5, pawn d5, bishop takes c6, pawn takes c6, knight takes e7, queen takes e7, rook e1, queen h4, bishop e3, pawn f6, pawn f3, pawn takes e5, pawn takes e4, pawn d4, pawn g3, queen f6, bishop takes d4, pawn takes d4, rook f1, queen takes f1, queen takes f1, rook takes f1, king takes f1, rook b8, pawn b3, rook b5, pawn c4, rook h5, king g1, pawn c5, knight d2, king f7, rook f1, king e7, pawn a3, rook h6, pawn h4, rook a6, rook a1, bishop g4, king f2, king e6, pawn a4, king e5, king g2, rook f6, rook e1, pawn d3, rook f1, king d4, rook takes f6, pawn takes f6, king f2, pawn c6, pawn a5, pawn a6, knight b1, king takes e4, king e1, bishop e2, knight d2, king e3, knight b1, pawn f5, knight d2, pawn h5, knight b1, king f3, knight c3, king takes g3, knight a4, pawn f4, knight takes c5, pawn f3, knight e4, king f4, knight d6, pawn c5, pawn b4, pawn takes b4, pawn c5, pawn b3, knight c4, king g3, knight e3, pawn b2,